Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us John Eidsmoe. He's a colonel and chaplain of the Guard in the Air Force. Is this correct?
Chaplain in the Guard and retired lieutenant colonel and judge advocate or lawyer with the Air Force. So
also an author, and he's here to talk with us about his latest book, which is about the history of law and the nature of law. And it's something interesting to think about, that what is the basis of law? And how does law, of course you talk about separation of church and state, but has law ever been separate from religious morality? This is such an interesting concept to get into. And so, yeah, real pleasure having you on the show.
And you too. Thank you, Josh.
About us. So tell us about your book first.
Well, the questions that you just asked are the basic questions that the book asks and tries to answer. What is the actual origin of law?
So show us the book for the audience again.
It's a 3-volume set. Here's volume 1, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. But in volume 1, we demonstrate that, first of all, the cornerstone of the legal system is the Hebrew system, with its 10 commandments and the other laws that we see in the Hebrew system, and also go on to other ancient systems from Mesopotamia to China to even the Inca and the Aztec and so on, demonstrating a couple of things. First of all, these systems of law do not evolve from the simple to the complex. They start as very complex and sophisticated systems and often degenerate with time. And number 2, every one of these societies believes that its laws come to them from God or the gods or the Tao or some higher source than man. And the idea that law is merely a creation of the state or a creation of man is simply a modern aberration.
This is a very profound concept. When we talk about, you mentioned the laws start out as very maybe idealistic and complex and believed to originate from the divine and then decline
as time goes on. They become much more prolific, that is, they expand, but being bigger is not necessarily better. I believe it was Chesterton who once said that we must be governed by the 10 commandments of God, or we will most surely be governed by the 10,000 commandments of man. And we're certainly moving in that direction now.
I think we're already there.
Well, moving away from God's laws does not bring freedom.
Yeah, as we've seen. So tell us, of course, you look not just at the U.S. system. I was flipping through your book earlier, actually. And it's interesting because you really cover the laws of just about every major civilization in history, at least that we know of. Tell us some of the lessons you've seen from this and why you felt it was important to mention those in your book.
One of the things that I see is the need for constitutional restraints. And we see a trend throughout the world that government tends to centralize, tends to get larger with time, and with that you have a corresponding decline of freedom. And you need strong constitutional restraints. Even with Israel, we see, first of all, a very limited government under the judges of the 12 tribes, and then a limited king and Saul, a little expanded with David, big government under Solomon, and then after that, of course, the divided kingdoms thereafter. We see the same with Greece, we see the same with Rome. We're seeing it right now with many of the nations in Europe, and we are seeing it in the United States. To see the limited government that we started with, and how George Washington began his administration in 1789 with 350 federal civilian employees, to the point where we have several million today. Well, that growth simply means a decline of freedom. Every one of those employees in some way is regulating a portion of our lives.
And that's an interesting principle because we talk about I can't remember who said it, but it's the bigger the government, the smaller the man, right?
That's well said. And Luther, in fact, once said that the larger government is, the more laws, the worse the government is. He said, I've never known a kingdom that had many laws that was well governed.
And I assume through your research on different civilizations, you've seen this phenomenon. Is that accurate?
Definitely. You can even look to the Inca, the Maya, the Aztecs. They began as local city-states and gradually become empires with strong dictatorships. Now, in contrast to that, you look to the Iroquois Confederacy, which managed to have some very clear limits on what the Confederacy can do as against what the original 5 nations, later the Tuscarora joined them, what they can do. You see a balancing of power between the war chiefs and the peace chiefs, between the central and the local tribes, between the bigger tribes and the littler tribes. You even see a separation of powers between men and women. Only men can be chiefs, but only women can nominate chiefs.
Really? That's pretty
And
interesting.
property lines tend to pass through the women. And it's a fascinating system.
Interesting. We were talking off camera a little bit about some interesting points that, maybe just to emphasize kind of how deep you've gone in your research. You showed that, if I remember right, that the U.S. system and the British system were different from the Roman system, which sometimes when we think of Rome, we think of it as having dominated all of Europe in terms of law, and that is the main influence on the American legal system. But you said it's different. Could you explain that?
I would disagree. I would say it is different.
Okay, I was talking, it must have been some other conversation.
No, that was our conversation, but I mean, I disagree with the thesis that America is founded on Roman law. And I know that's not what you're saying either.
Yes.
Saying I disagree wasn't a very good way of introducing that.
Okay, go ahead.
But I go back to 9 AD, one of the most decisive battles in Western history, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest.
Right, and before we talked about it, I like to know my history. I did not know this story.
This is in northern Germany. A German chieftain, Hermann, later known as Hermann the Liberator, united some of the northern German tribes, lured a number of the Roman legions, 3 of them, across the Rhine, and defeated them in a very decisive battle. The result of this was that northern Germany and Scandinavia were forever free from the centralizing influence of Roman law. The southern German tribes, their codes, the Salic Code, the Lombardic Code, and others like this, these are basically Roman law with a few German trimmings. But north of the Rhine, you have pure Germanic common law, and those tribes of the north of Germany, the Angles and the Saxons, then in the 400s bring that Anglo-Saxon common law to England. It becomes the law of England, and from England, of course, it's exported to the United States.
Now, tell us about the difference between the Roman legal system and the northern kind of German legal system. Because when, if we think about Germany at that time, we picture basically like a bunch of barbarians, right? they're not portrayed very well by history. But you make it sound like their legal system was actually quite good.
Their legal system, I think, is remarkable, in contrast to the very centralized Roman system. And Rome starts as a republic, of course, with the Roman Senate being the governing body. Gradually, they will allow a dictator to serve for, I believe it's 6 months, and then he has to surrender his power, but then they start letting him extend his time more and more, and gradually, as we move from the republic to the Caesars, we see that the Caesars, the emperors, are making decisions, and the Senate merely rubber stamps what the emperor says. Now, in contrast, you have very decentralized government in those northern tribes of Germany. You have, for example, every town will have a council of freemen, which is referred to as an Althing, and or a Witan in Germany, Althing in the Scandinavian countries. They would meet twice a year, and they would elect a man that they called a law speaker. The law speaker would serve a 3-year term. Every year before the council, he was required to recite from memory the law, and it was short enough that he could do that in front of this council, some of whom had previously been law speakers, all of whom had heard it recited many times throughout their lives. The result of this is that it becomes common law. It becomes the common possession of the people. They all know it. It isn't just a little elite group of lawyers that know the law. It's the possession of the people.
It's interesting, and we're in a state now where regulatory systems are so long and complex that corporations, big companies need to hire like regulatory compliance advisors to make sure they're not violating the law, because they can't even interpret the law. It's so complex. There's so many contradictions and stuff.
Exactly, and part of the idea of law is to be able to give people a good idea as to what is accepted and what is prohibited, so that I know if I'm going to engage in this course of conduct, the government will approve of it or disapprove of it, or I'll be prosecuted. In other words, I should be able to know that in advance. And that's why under the old common law, as simple as it was and as short as it was, we could have the presumption that people know the law, and so we could say ignorance of the law is no excuse. Today, I'm not really sure we can sustain that idea anymore. I mean, even lawyers don't know the law, and it's hard to presume that even lawyers know it today, but anyway, so there was some value in the earlier systems.
Now let's talk about the nature of religion as it relates to law, because you said, first off, that most legal systems, if not all of them, people believed originated from their creator, and these declined over time, typically. Now, can law be separate from religion? Because typically religion is the standards of how we choose to interact with others, at least when applied on the normal level, the earthly plane, right?
I would agree completely. First of all, if you look to the idea of separation of church and state, the first country in history that I can tell that ever practiced a separation of church and state was Old Testament Israel. And people are surprised to hear that, but when you look, you see that Israel's kings, the civil rulers, come out of the tribe of Judah. Israel's priests, the religious leaders, come out of the tribe of Levi. Separate offices, separate functions, but both are under the authority of God, and both are subject to the law of God, because law ultimately is morality. What you're doing when you pass a law is you're saying, this is what we believe is right, and this particular type of conduct, murder for example, is something that we believe is wrong. And not only do we believe it's wrong, but we are going to force that belief on people who don't agree with us. Even if you don't agree with that idea that murder is wrong. If you commit murder and you say, well, I think we need to be pro-choice on this subject of murder, every person should decide that for himself. If you believe that, well, that's not going to get you anywhere in the courts. The idea of law is to take a moral principle and enact it into law and require people to comply with it. So ultimately, all law is based upon morality. And ultimately, all morality is based upon religion, whether it's Christian religion, Islamic religion, Sharia law, or whether it's a humanistic religion like Marxism. Ultimately, it's going to be based upon religious belief.
And I think that is inescapable. Even atheism and its technical, more moral system that people might have has some foundation, right? It is inescapable that we have values that we hold ourselves to and we believe should somehow affect the governance of the world in terms of what we think is right and wrong. It's a very natural human thing, actually.
And sometimes I think you find today that atheists are kind of like living off inherited capital. In other words, they hold certain moral principles that were taught to them by their parents or grandparents and so on, and even if they no longer recognize the source of those values, they still hold them. But will their children or grandchildren hold them? I don't believe in the long run that you can sustain morality without religious belief. In the short run, maybe.
We've seen the experiments of this under the Soviet Union and other communist countries, which were atheist, publicly atheist practices and that persecuted people who believed in religion. Even today under the Chinese Communist Party, we've seen the terrible human cost of that, actually. 100 million to 150 million people killed.
And I am certainly thankful to see EPIC taking a stand against communism. So many in the West today believe that if there ever was a communist threat, it evaporated in 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union. But the fact is, communism is still strong in China. It's even stronger in Korea, although I would argue that the governing ideology of North Korea has mutated somewhat and has mutated somewhat and has moved a little bit from Marxism to Nazism with the idea of the North Korean master race and so on.
Yeah, the communism and Nazism, they're an inch apart from each other.
Well, they're both based on Darwinian thought. And people think of Darwinism as just a theory of origins, but in fact it's a very comprehensive worldview. And it's a materialist worldview that everything proceeds by natural causes and development, clash and development and so on, struggle for survival and the like. Nazism comes out of this. Nazism's idea is that there is a racial consciousness, and the race is above the individual. The individual means nothing. The race is everything, and over the race you have the state and the Führer. But that some races evolve further than others, and the Aryan race has evolved into a master race, whereas the Jewish race is a parasite on the master race that needs to be eradicated. Now, communism also sees the idea of the Darwinian class struggle. In fact, Karl Marx wanted to dedicate the English version of Das Kapital to Darwin because he says, Darwin has given me a biological basis for the class struggle. And the struggle there It's much the same struggle as you see it in Nazism, National Socialism, except in Nazism, the struggle is between nations or races. In communism, the struggle is between classes, nobility versus serfs, or the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and so on. And so, but the same governing ideology, Darwinism, applies to both.
And of course, the moral systems, their beliefs had morals attached to them, and the morals dictated their actions, and we saw the terrible cost of those actions.
But morality, as they see it, is not rooted in God, not rooted in what God says, His commands. Morality, rather, is what advances the interest of the communist cause. And ultimately, what advances that is determined by the Communist Party. So whatever advances the Communist Party is right, whatever does not is wrong. And anybody who opposes the Communist Party, therefore, is an enemy of the state and to be eradicated or re-educated.
That's right. Well, I've talked about it before, actually, that one of the things so for example, when you talk about, say, political correctness, we can trace this back to Mao Zedong in 1967. The basic, in China, for example, the term political correctness still has its original meaning, even though I think in the West it's still practiced the same, just interpreted differently. But it was basically that if you follow what the government says, you are politically correct. If you oppose it, you are not politically correct. And during that time, Cultural Revolution era, you could be killed if you opposed it. And now what it is, it's a political moral system that changes based on policy, that has many iterations and changes and warps all the time and might even contradict itself. But you as an individual who see, at least under those systems, who's forced to recognize, unless you want to be persecuted, the Communist Party is the highest power in the land, need to move with that or face persecution.
Exactly. And again, that's where I think this current controversy in America concerning monuments becomes very important, because it's an attempt to rewrite history, as though there is no objective truth in history. It's whatever we want to say. It reminds me very much of George Orwell with 1984, where he has the Ministry of Truth saying, "He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past." If we can eradicate monuments and rewrite the history books so that something is written out of history, then it's as though it never happened. And first they come for the Confederate monuments, next they're coming for the Columbus monuments, now it's Washington and Jefferson. What's next is going to be whatever the current PC power that be wants to have eliminated. But I say that monuments ultimately are voices of dissent. They are a voice saying to the current politically correct orthodoxy that there was a time when people thought and acted differently, and we ought to at least take that into consideration.
And in your book, it's interesting that, of course you have your own faith, but you looked very objectively and, I think very reasonably at the faiths of others and how that affected law. And use that to form a real clear basis of what is law, In other words, people you might disagree with when it comes to belief and even morals, I'd assume, but you took a real objective look at what they did.
Well, I tried to do that, and like Sir William Blackstone, who influenced our founding fathers greatly. In fact, it was said that many an argument in an early American court was settled by a quote from Blackstone, and also said that Blackstone's commentaries sold more copies in America than they did in England, because in England they had the tradition to rely on. Here out in the wilderness, we needed it in writing. But Blackstone talks about three kinds of law. He says, first of all, there is the revealed law, which he says is found only in the Holy Scriptures. Then he says there is the law of nature, which he said is also the will of God, dictated by God himself, but that we understand through the God-given facility of human reason. And then there's human law, which is, or municipal law as he calls it, the attempt by man to take the law of nature and the revealed law and apply it to our society. But the idea of a law of nature, or what Paul would call the law of God written on our hearts in Romans 2:14-15, this idea of this law of nature is something universal. In fact, Luther even said that the Ten Commandments were not originally given to Moses. The Ten Commandments were written on the heart of everyone. It was most perfectly expressed on Mount Sinai. But in fact, you can even look through, in fact, I have a chapter here where I talk about justice in Genesis. And of course, we receive the Mosaic law in Exodus, but I demonstrate that in the book of Genesis, every one of the 10 Commandments is found at least in a rudimentary form. Part of it is what I sometimes refer to as echoes from Eden, that after the world disperses, after Eden and then after the flood, there are still some recollections from them. And God, I think, works on those by writing the law in our hearts. Luther called that the natural grace, Calvin common grace. Others refer to it as civil righteousness or human good. But God has written those principles of right and wrong on all of us. And that's why you find these basic things, like adultery, like murder, like theft and so on, with some variations, you find that these apply in almost all societies. And C.S. Lewis especially notes this in his book, The Abolition of Man.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, I guess just as a last question, what made you want to write this very large series of books, three tomes about that thick altogether? What made you decide to take that on?
First of all, I had been asked to teach a course at the Regent Law School in Virginia Beach on historical and theological foundations of law. And then later I was teaching the same course for the Handong International Law School in South Korea, and also at several other schools too. But one of the things I found was that I had to gather so many different sources together in order to teach this course. Certain writings from some of the Greek philosophers, biblical writings, common law writings, and so on. And anyway, so I thought somebody needs to put this together in a book. And so then I thought, well, why not me? Anyway, so that's what I've tried to do. And by the way, I will mention that the book has been awarded the silver medal by the Independent Publishers Association, and so I'm proud of that. But it's a 3-volume set and published by Nordskog Publishers, a very good conservative Christian publisher. And anyway, so I'm hoping this will have an impact, and hoping that long after I'm gone, that this information will be here so that those who want to dig it out in future generations will have it available.
Great. So where can people find your book?
They can write to me directly, or they can go to the publisher, Nordskog, Nordskog, just Google that and you'll find it. Either way, or you can find them on Amazon. Best price is usually going to come from me, but as I say, it is a 3-volume set.
How do they get in touch with you?
Best way to do that is my email, which maybe you can put that on the screen, Eidsmoe, Eidsmoe, at juno.com.
Right, there we go. Historical and Theological Foundations of Law. Actually pretty interesting. I told you I was flipping through it earlier today.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. A real pleasure having you on the show.
And you as well, Josh.
Thank you.
My best wishes on your venture here with Epic, and I'm looking forward to following your ministry further.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.